Thank you so much. Let me just give me a second to share my screen. I think you should all be able to see my title slide now with this lovely view of the Indian Ocean from Gullface Green in Colombo. But David, thank you so much for that introduction. I don't know if I can live up to what you said, but I'll certainly try. And thank all of you for coming. I know this is Friday afternoon, and you've probably got a million and one better things to be doing. Some of them maybe including alcohol, but it's great to be able to spend this time and talking to you a little bit about what I think of as one of the most interesting projects I've done over the past few years. And as David mentioned, that is being part of his Faith project, which we started, and it was 2018, 2019 in a pre-COVID world. And I was lucky enough to squeeze in a couple of fieldwork trips to Sri Lanka, one at the end of 2019 and one at the very beginning of 2020, just before everything started to shut down because of the COVID pandemic. So, I subsequently had this wonderfully quiet stretch of about 2 years where we couldn't travel anywhere, we couldn't do anything particularly fun. So I just buried myself in sort of the research that I'd been doing before then. And as an outcome of that, I have developed some of the work that are outputs of the project. And I'm actually quite sort of proud of them. I think that there's some of my best work in many respects, because I really do think they're interesting in terms of the themes that they pull together, very disparate themes, but I think quite interesting things. So with that in mind, thank you very much for being here. This is a paper that I did actually present to a much smaller group of scholars at a workshop that David and I hosted around the middle of last year. It was June 2020. And I presented this paper in its bare bones format. So what that means is that I basically presented a load of photographs and sort of waffled around them and tried to say something semi-coherent. So what I've done for this presentation is I've kept the photographs, but I've filled in between the photographs with a bit of text and a bit of more conceptual, more fancy sort of academic-y stuff to try and sound a bit more intelligent. This paper is part of, well, hopefully it will be, it hasn't yet been accepted, but hopefully it'll be part of a special issue that David and I are guest editing for Modern Asian Studies, which is advancing the organizing rubric of the special issue is the idea, the conceptual, the theoretical idea of the infrastructural commons. And we're using the BRI and its manifestations in various South and Southeast Asian countries to think through what this idea of the infrastructural commons is, or what it might be. So the theoretical framing is very much to do with infrastructure. I won't talk too much today about the commoning part, because that tends to, David and I struggled over this for many weeks, thinking about what actually we mean by the infrastructural commons. I'm going to leave that part to one side for today, and I'm going to focus very much on some of the theoretical novelties that I think are raised by looking at the BRI as an infrastructural project and how it manifests in a specific context in Sri Lanka, and what that means in terms of other infrastructural formations, so religion and the natural world, what I'm looking at here. So that's sort of the rough idea. So I'm just going to dive in. I hear we've got 50 minutes. I might be faster than that. I might take longer than that, but I'll try and stay certainly within an hour or so to leave a bit of time at the end for Q&A. If indeed there are any questions. So maybe I'll just sort of explain this photo first, because this sort of provides quite a nice contextual overview of the study site for this paper. This is a place called Gullface, and this is part of the beach. And if you look to the left, that's basically the Indian Ocean. And if you look sort of that way and then up a bit, you sort of see India and Tamil Nadu and around there. And on the horizon there, you can see a big construction project. And that is basically one of the largest, most significant projects that the Chinese are building or are still building in Sri Lanka as part of the BRI. It's called the Colombo Port City, and it's essentially a new city. It's a huge tract of reclaimed land from the ocean. And that is, you can see it's quite an eyesore. It's a huge appendage sitting out, attached to the coastline, the western coastline of Sri Lanka. And this is the study site. This is what I'm interested in. This is what this paper is all about. So this kind of sets the scene quite nicely, I think. Before I delve into the actual paper and my arguments, I wanted to take a bit of a step back and take the audience through some of the previously published outputs from this project. So in order to do this, my reasons for doing this are that you will get an idea for how my thinking has evolved over it's been sort of 5 years since we first started the Britain Faith project. So I want to give you an overview of the genesis of my ideas, my thinking, and then maybe the actual paper that I'm presenting will start to make a bit more sense when you see sort of the genealogy of where it comes from. So I'm going to give you an overview of some of the other work that I have published on the Belt and Road in Sri Lanka. I'm going to start with this paper. So this is a paper, this is actually the most recently published paper. It just came out a few weeks ago, although actually it was accepted at the end of 2021. So it's been in production for nearly 2 years, basically. But this is sort of one of the broadest papers. It's in the Journal of Contemporary Religion, but it actually looks at how the post-war period in Sri Lanka, which when we're talking about Sri Lanka, we're talking about the year 2009 onwards, when the civil war between the Tamil Tigers and the government officially ended. And that ushered in a new era of neoliberalism within the country. In the history of Sri Lanka, in the modern history of Sri Lanka, there have been several waves of neoliberal reform, which have spurred economic growth, but they've also been incredibly damaging, as you can probably imagine, to local communities and to economies and to various groups within the country. So what I'm looking at this paper is, in broad brushstrokes, this period of time, this 10 to 15 years since 2009, the neoliberal shifts that have occurred since then, and how religious groups have adapted. So how do different religions respond to these neoliberal shifts that we've been observing over the past 10 to 15 years in Sri Lanka? And obviously, if we're putting a marker in the sand at the year 2009, this is slightly before when the Belt and Road started to materialize. And so Chinese investment in Sri Lanka since 2009 is very much driving this neoliberalization of various facets of life. The neoliberalization of the ocean, for example, the neoliberalization of religious groups, of Catholicism, of local communities, and so on and so forth. So that's the aim of this project. This paper, very broad, but it offers this sort of holistic overview of religion and this new wave of investment in Sri Lanka. So that's the first paper, which is ironically the most recently published. The second paper is in a journal called Political Geography, and this is squarely about infrastructure. There's no religion in this paper. I don't think I mentioned the word religion or any religious group, but this is simply about two of the biggest infrastructural mega projects that have that now define Chinese investment under the rubric of the Belt and Road in Sri Lanka. They are the Colombo Port City project, which is the focus of this paper I'm presenting today, and part of that picture that I showed you in the cover slide, but also the building of a new port in the very south of the country in a place called Hambantota. And why I choose to focus on these two infrastructural mega projects in the paper is because they are both examples of infrastructure at a huge scale. And not just that, they're also slightly absurd because, as you can see from the first clause of the title here, a harbour in the country, a city in the sea. The Colombo Port City is building a city in the ocean. So there is this illogic to that, right? And then for the Hambantota Port project, it's the logic of building a harbour in the country, not in the sea. And so what they did for that project is the Chinese actually excavated a lot of land on the southern coastline in order to build this harbour, which is basically not fit for purpose because they can't dig deep enough because of the bedrock and stuff. So actually, it's a white elephant. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as it's meant to. But these two opposing, absurd, large-scale infrastructural projects reveal quite interesting insights into what I term the slippages of sovereignty. So how infrastructure can actually be a conduit through which sovereignty can be challenged and can be asserted. So Sri Lankan sovereignty can be challenged, and Chinese claims to Sri Lankan land can be asserted. So that's a kind of novelty. That's the contribution of that second paper. The third paper is probably closest to the paper that I'm going to present today. And this is looking at the nexus of infrastructure and religion. So this is in a journal called the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, which is the flagship journal for American geography. And it's basically thinking about what happens to religion, what happens to understandings of the sacred when we bring them into conversation with infrastructure development, infrastructure investment. And so this paper empirically focuses on the Colombo Port City, the same empirical focus as this paper that I'm about to present today. And the novelty, the contribution of this idea is this idea of the supra-sacred, so something beyond the sacred meaning something associated with sort of organized religion, in this case, Catholicism. So when you bring infrastructure development into conversation with that, what happens, how does the idea of the sacred move beyond the boundaries of institutional, of organized religion? And so what I'm looking at here is beyond religion, the embrace of much more primordial environmental ontologies of the sacred. So this is what I mean by bringing all these different ideas together of infrastructure, religion, the environment, and sort of what happens when you have that potent mix of forces, many of which align, many of which do not align and create tensions and ruptures and things like that. So this is a paper that I draw on quite heavily for the current paper that I'm presenting. Finally, I'm sorry if you're bored, let me just go through one more. And that's this one, which is, again, a sort of review paper. This paper was very much the precursor to the special issue that David and I are editing. So this is looking, as you can see by the title, this idea of being located between the commons and the cosmic. So again, thinking about the environment as a form of commons and the cosmos as a sort of heuristic to think about religion or transcendence or belief or things like that. And so thinking about how the BRI can actually be a trigger for sacred politics throughout the countries that are implicated by Chinese infrastructure investment. I believe David was actually very kindly one of the reviewers for this paper, and he gave me quite an easy passage through. So I'm always very grateful to him for that. I didn't know it at the time. It was only afterwards that I knew that. Anyway, I'll stop here. But my point in going through this genesis, this intellectual journey with you, is to sort of make the point that the paper I'm presenting today is very much a coalescence of all of these papers. It's sort of bringing parts of each of the four I've mentioned together into something which is kind of new. And the idea that I'm advancing today is this idea of infrastructural splintering, how infrastructures splinter, crack, and create these gaps which can be exploited for various ends. So that's the first part. So I've gone through the sort of genesis of the thinking. Let me now do what I call, this is meant to be, if I was sort of more serious, I'll call this sort of the literature review or theoretical framework or something like that. But actually it's just a load of jargon. As I mentioned at the beginning, I presented a bare bones version of this paper in June at a workshop in June last year with David. And some of the feedback I received from anthropologists is that there was too much theory. I didn't think there was any theory in it, but they found it far too theoretical for their liking. They much prefer empiricism. So in that spirit, I'm going to call this section jargon, because this is the theoretical piece of my work. This is the sort of theoretical framing for the argument that follows. So the starting off point, there's a premise, the starting off point for this paper, and indeed for the special issue, is that the BRI, the projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, not just in Sri Lanka, but throughout Southeast Asia and beyond, throughout the whole region that is implicated in the BRI, it is what we call an infrastructural vortex, right? A vortex, something that brings different infrastructural formations together into conversation with each other, but also into collision with each other. So the BRI is an infrastructural layer that comes into contact, competition, and collision with pre-existing infrastructural formations, right? And this is kind of the jumping off point, because in critical infrastructure studies as a sort of scholarly field, there has over the past sort of 2 or 3 years, quite recently, been a sense of dissatisfaction with how infrastructure is studied and understood. The normative understanding of infrastructure is something very material, something that enables something to do something. A road enables a car to travel between points A and B, right? There's been a sense of dissatisfaction with that actually infrastructure is so much more than that. It's much bigger. It's more than human. It's more than material in many respects. So as an infrastructural vortex, the BRI causes once shared resources. This is where the idea of the commons come in, this idea of commoning. It causes once shared resources and a public or common good to become infrastructuralized in ways that bring about a renegotiation of meaning and value. So with this in mind, how I would think of infrastructure and how my understanding of infrastructure that I advance in this paper is that it's taken to be, you can look at it in 2 ways. One is from one of my previous papers. It's a connective tissue. It's something that a vortex, right? Brings things together and connects them. It's a connective tissue that brings seemingly disparate and diverse entities into conversation and productive tension with each other. That's my kind of way of thinking about it from some previous work. Another definition from somebody else is that infrastructure can be seen as a collective term. It's a singular noun that, like a system or a network or an assemblage or something similar to that, denotes a plurality of integrated parts that support some higher order project, right? It has a bigger meaning to it, right? Natural ecosystems are about life and living and reproduction and things like that. They're not just about fish swimming throughout the sea, whatever else it may be. So this idea, this sort of theoretical perspective of an infrastructural vortex is important for scholarship on the BRI, as it can reveal both the close interoperability of material, natural, and supernatural infrastructural formations. So the material projects of the BRI, natural, things like natural ecosystems, the ocean, something that's of interest to me in this project, and the supernatural, right? Things that transcend the natural world, religion, beliefs, things like this. But it also shows the BRI's influential role in disrupting any pre-existing sense of infrastructural equilibrium, right? So just as we often think of infrastructures as maintaining some sort of equilibrium, it can also disrupt them. It can cause them to rupture and to manifest in a state of disequilibrium. So by paying attention to these equilibriums or these disequilibriums set in motion by these large-scale, infrastructural development projects like the BRI, new understandings of infrastructural politics can emerge. Okay. I've only got a few slides like this. As I said, it's very jargony, but I need to do it to sort of satisfy myself. So I begin with the premise that there is, with the BRI, we're revealing what I call infrastructural overlap, right? This is very simply where we have infrastructures layered upon other infrastructures, okay? So the material infrastructures of the BRI, the dams, the reclaimed land, the ports, the roads, all of these things that are built under the rubric of the BRI, they intersect with other infrastructural formations, triggering processes of what I call infrastructural splintering, okay? So there are 3 this idea of, the BRI is a pressure test of how strong, coherent, or sustainable other infrastructural formations might be. And often, as I sort of show later in this paper, it shows actually how weak or unstable or incoherent they really are. So it realizes, it manifests these weaknesses in infrastructure as a formation. So what am I interested in this paper? I'm looking at three overlapping and primary infrastructural formations. Of course, the port city. This is the material manifestation of the BRI. It is a huge tract of reclaimed land in the middle of the Indian Ocean, upon which a new port is meant to be built. Sorry, not a new port, a new city is meant to be built. Right. So this is one infrastructural formation. But it's not the only one. I'm also interested in the ocean. The ocean is a natural ecosystem. It's the home to fish and marine life. And it's also a source of resource dependence for fishing communities that populate the western coastline of Sri Lanka. So the natural world, the things, the ecosystems like the ocean are another form of infrastructure. They can be thought of as the infrastructure of infrastructure. And then third one that I'm interested in is the Catholic Church. And so Sri Lanka is a multi-religious country. You know, it's a majority Buddhist, but it acknowledges a plurality of religious groups. But along Sri Lanka's western coastline, Catholics are overrepresented. It has a long tradition of Catholicism. And so I'm interested in the Catholic Church and the institutions associated with it, so Catholic schools and Catholic burial plots and things like that, as another infrastructural formation. So I'm interested in the overlaps, the layering, the overlaps, and the tensions between these three specific infrastructures. Coincidentally, literally yesterday, I published another paper, which is also very, very different from this project, which is about the body, also advancing this idea of infrastructural overlap. So the paper is actually about tattooed Asians and how the understanding of tattoos leads to all these representational slippages and politics and stuff. I have exactly the same arguments in that paper, which is we're looking at a plurality of infrastructures which are layered on top of each other. So in the language of that paper, you have ink. The ink of tattoos is one infrastructural formation. It's a form of representation, of self-assertion, of asserting your identity, your personality. That's one. The second is the infrastructure of the skin, which gives rise to certain racial characteristics or understandings or of beauty or fairness of whatever it may be. And then the third is the infrastructure of the body as part of the metabolics of capital and how capitalism works. So these ideas I found, to be quite rich and quite useful. And my reason for sort of telling this to you is that I've managed to apply them to other projects as well. Very, very different from this project, but I think that the translational value of them is quite useful. Of course, it remains to be seen if anybody else actually finds them useful, apart from me. But at least I find them, sort of interesting to play with. Anyway, this is sort of the final substantive jargony slide. And this is just looking at this idea of infrastructural splintering, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the main sort of theoretical contribution of this paper. So this premise of infrastructural overlap, right? The port city, the ocean as an aquatic ecosystem, the Catholic Church, they're all overlapping infrastructures. This premise foregrounds the need to recognize the boundaries and therefore the continuities of infrastructure and how one might bleed into or otherwise influence another one. They infrastructure splinter when they're weakened by infrastructural overlap, when they become incoherent, when they become destabilized. The non-alignment of overlapping infrastructures causes them to become less coherent or stable. And so when infrastructural splintering occurs, forces that transcend any one infrastructural formation can start to seep into and shape everyday patterns of socio-political organization. Now, in more real terms, this is all very abstract, it's all very theoretical. What am I actually trying to say? So in more real terms, this occurs when the logics of capitalist extraction come into contact with the social, cultural, and economic mores of subsistence livelihoods, causing these livelihoods to be internally politicized according to their capitalist orientations or disorientations. Or it occurs when the mega projects of the BRI, the Port City Colombo as one example, come into contact with resource-dependent communities, the outcomes of which can be seen as life-changing opportunities or challenges for stakeholders in these communities, right? The tensions that emerge as a result are implicitly infrastructural in scope, as they are implicated in the transformation of meaning and value. So overlap, this idea of infrastructural overlap creates, in other words, the conditions through which forces that transcend any one infrastructural formation can start to seep into and shape everyday patterns of social and political organization. And I will leave it there, but I will start to illustrate these ideas with real examples later in the paper. Finally, I'll just go through these quickly. This is just one of the problems or one of the habits I have, which is always to justify, to sell myself, well, what are the contributions of this? I'll go through these very quickly. So the main contributions of this paper, of my arguments, firstly, it contributes to a growing body of scholarship that is aiming to explicate the so-called new. I mean, it's not really new that anymore. You know, it's been sort of going around for a few years now. But this idea of a ground-up politics of the Belt and Road Initiative, so privileging the voices of communities and of people on the ground who are affected by the infrastructural projects of the BRI. This is often in contradistinction to the voices of state actors and of the machinery of policy and things like that. So it's part of this wave, this sort of new wave of scholarship that's really privileging the lived experiences of the BRI and its projects. The second is to think about infrastructure as something that is very voluminous, right? It's not flat. It's not a sort of horizontal thing that sort of nestles against other things. It's voluminous. It has volumes to it. And I think my idea of infrastructural overlap, that sort of aims to realize or to highlight this idea of volume in a slightly clearer way. So, I mean, in the very real terms, in the example of this paper, we're looking at the depth of the ocean, but also the heights of the cosmos as well. You know, infrastructure is not just limited to a road, but also the volumes that surround that road, because they're all overlapping, right? They're all in conversation with each other. And then finally, the final point, again, is to sort of ride the wave of some excellent and very recent sort of critical scholarship coming out of geography, which is my discipline, by people looking at people like Man Barua from the University of Cambridge, who is advancing this idea of a more than human infrastructural ontology. So critical infrastructure studies over the past sort of 10 years or so, it has increasingly moved beyond the material and started to embrace the human dimensions of infrastructure. But actually, people like Man Barua are talking about this more than human, looking at animals and the natural world. And as I argue in this paper, part of the supernatural world as also being part of this infrastructural perspective, this infrastructural way of thinking about social and political life and organization. Okay. That's enough. As I said, that is the jargon part out of the way. If you didn't follow or understand any of that, then don't worry, neither did I. It's just it's a necessity, right? You have to do it. Okay, in this third part of the presentation, I want to be a bit more realistic. So to talk in much more real terms about what's happening in Sri Lanka. So this is my kind of context, my scene setting part of the presentation, where I actually talk about real life stuff that's happening in Sri Lanka. So here's a few photos. As I mentioned, this is what I originally presented at the workshop last year. So the photo on the left, what this shows, this is from 2014. When the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping and the incumbent Premier of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa, there in the red sort of scarf and white top, when they inked the deal to build the Port City Colombo project. So that's them together in Colombo, looking over a model of what the Port City Colombo is meant to look like. To the right of that picture, at the top, you can see sort of current progress. I can't remember. I don't know when this photograph was taken. I assume it was pre-COVID. And so there would have been some progress made by then, but I can't for sure say how much. But the last time I visited Sri Lanka, which was early 2020, this is very much how it looked. I mean, I didn't see it from a helicopter, but from the coastline, you basically just see this, this kind of berm going all the way around the outside. And then on the actual bit of reclaimed land, just a bunch of cranes. So it's very much a construction site. They have reclaim the land, or they are making progress to reclaim the land, but there isn't yet any city to justify the name of the Colombo Port City project. And then finally, the picture at the bottom there, the bottom right, again, that's just an image of what it's meant to be like. It's meant to be a dazzling, modern, world-class city, akin to the likes of Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Singapore and Hong Kong and places like that. Obviously, a stark contrast to the actual Colombo city, which it's attached to, and which is a very, very different place in which to live and work. Okay. So just coming back and giving you a bit of historical context, it was 2014 when the picture on the left was taken, when Xi Jinping and Mahinda Rajapaksa actually signed the deal to build the Port City Colombo project. Just 1 year later, so in 2015, Mahinda Rajapaksa was democratically removed from power. He was voted out due to allegations of financial misconduct and various other things. In his place was voted in a coalition government led by President Maithripala Sirisena. Since then, he was removed. Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother was put in, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So there's been a lot of political flip-flopping over the past few years, over the past decade or so. For those of you that are sort of relatively up to date with Sri Lankan politics, you will remember that over the COVID-19 period, the incumbent president Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he was forcefully removed from power by people who stormed his house, and he actually fled to Singapore. And so, since 2015 onwards, the country has very much been in a state of political turmoil. It's been very, very disrupted, and you could sort of speculate that the Chinese BRI investment has had a role to play in catalyzing these very divisive politics of the country. So that's sort of what the port city is meant. That's what the Colombo Port City is meant to be, what it's meant to look like. That vision is not yet realized. Whether or not it will be realized remains an open-ended question. Okay, I'm a geographer, so I need to include some maps. So here is a map of the western coastline, and just a very small part of the western coastline of Sri Lanka. So at the bottom there, you can see Colombo. So that's the capital city. Just to the left of where it says Colombo, you can see a green bit of land sort of stretching out into the sea. That is the Port City project. And to the north, you can see Negombo, and just below that, a place called Katunayake, which is where the main international airport is based. So why I say that, why I sort of show this tract of sea or land, coast, you could say, between Colombo and Negombo, is because this is very much the focus of my project, is all along there, specifically in Colombo, but I also did some research up in Negombo as well, which is a much bigger sort of fishing town, which is very well established and very well known for quite deep sea fishing. It's at a much bigger scale than what happens around Colombo. So more specifically, zooming in on the sort of specific part of Colombo that I was interested in, I did my research amongst fishermen and their wives here, in this, where the red circle is, in a ward called Colombo 15, which is called Modara. And as you can see, it's not quite overlooking the port city, but you can, if you stand on the beach in Modara, you can see that sort of, it looks like the claws of a crab, I always think, or a beetle or something. You can see that. And if you look out to sea towards the Indian Ocean, you can see these huge ships off the coast, which are actually dredging sand. So what they're doing, they are sucking up sand from the ocean floor, and then they basically dump it on the port city parts to reclaim the land. And that dredging has huge ecological consequences for these communities that are living in places like Modara and also further north in Negombo, because it causes the beach to slump. Right, so they're digging up sand from offshore, but all the sand sort of starts to shift that way, and the seabed starts to move because of gravity and I don't know the physics of it, but it all starts to move further out, and that causes the destruction of fishing grounds, of breeding grounds for fish, and it leads to basically chaos in the natural ecosystem. So that's kind of the significance of it. That's the importance of it. This is what Modara looks like. It's very much small scale fishing. It's people, it's families, a husband or a son with a boat and a couple of crew. It's that kind of scale fishing. It's very, very small scale. It's not the big trawler fishing, which is more associated with Negombo. This is kind of the environment. I guess what's interesting is that you'll notice this boat, if you just see the red box, this is a boat that's owned by St. Andrew's Parish. And so this is it gives an indication, a very loose indication of the role of the church in these fishing communities. And then finally, this is just just some shrines, some Catholic shrines, again, that you see everywhere along the western coastline of Sri Lanka, which again just sort of gives an idea of this very, very close relationship between fishing communities, the ocean, and the Catholic Church in this part of Sri Lanka. So that's sort of where the empirical work, this is where the empirical work is situated. Just a very quick overview of what I did, the actual work I did. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, I did my research in late 2019 and early 2020, pre-COVID. For those of you that sort of follow Sri Lanka, a lot has changed since then. So I'm talking about a very specific period of time. And I can't really comment on what has happened since early 2020, because I haven't been back to the country since then. And I've been involved in other projects. So there have been dramatic changes to the country, to the politics, the government of the country since then, which aren't captured in this paper, in this study, and which I'm not particularly well placed to comment on. In total, I conducted 71 interviews, but this paper actually draws on a subset of that sample, which is 28 interviews. The remaining sort of 40 or so, they were conducted in other parts of the country. So Hambantota in the south, where they were building that port, and various other parts of the country which were affected by Chinese infrastructure development. So of these 28, 13 were with fishermen and wives in Modara and also parts of Negombo. 7 were with reporters, journalists, members of the media. 4 were with Catholic priests and nuns, and then 4 were with environmental activists who were doing various things to campaign against the Port City project. Okay, I've been going for 40 minutes or so, so you'll be pleased to know that this is sort of the empirical section, which I will actually go through quite quickly, because it's more just illustrating some of the ideas that I've already raised in the earlier part of the presentation. So here I want to look at this idea of splinters, and what actually, in real terms, what do I mean when I talk about this idea of infrastructural splintering, okay? So basically what I'm going to show you is a bunch of data, of quotes from the people that I interviewed during my research, okay? So what we've seen, as I've already sort of mentioned several times, is that the western coastline of Sri Lanka has very much this sedimented infrastructure that's associated with the ocean, the Catholic Church, and now the most recent layer of this sediment is the port city. So here's some quotes. The one at the top is from Ajith, who's a journalist. He says, this is him talking about his grandparents' generation. So he's part of a family that has been living by the coast of Sri Lanka for many generations. And this is him talking about his grandparents' generation, where the Catholic Church and fishing people, they are one. They are that closely integrated and tied together. If the Catholic Church is something very special, the priest announces, next day we have a special program, don't go to sea, don't go fishing, come and stay with the church instead. It has that much power and influence over them. So then the entire village doesn't go to the sea. This is his grandparents' generation. And then Father Sebastian, one of the Catholic priests that I spoke to, he sort of shares this sentiment, saying how in the past, the Catholic Church built unity amongst these coastal fishing communities. It built loyalty amongst these people. So what we see here is not a case of infrastructural splintering, but actually a case of infrastructural strengthening, where you have, a couple of generations ago, you have the Catholic Church, these fishing communities which are dependent on the ocean for their survival. You have them integrated, you have them strengthening each other, you have them sort of being mutually supportive and mutually constitutive of each other. So this very much is, well, that's sort of the idea. That's the sort of the idyllic ideal from generations, decades ago, from Adja's grandparents' generation, for example. Now, more recently, in 2015, for those of you that know anything about sort of Catholic political ecology, there was a very important publication that was an encyclical that was published by the Catholic Church. This is again Father Sebastian. He says it's very important to listen to whatever the Pope is telling us. So thinking about this is another form of splintering, actually, where you think about the universalist appeal of Catholicism, but you have a very clearly demarcated center, which is in the Vatican, right? And then you have branches in all the countries in which Catholicism is present. So what Father Sebastian is saying, it's very important to listen to the center, to listen to whatever the Pope is telling us. Even the sea resources must be protected. My rights and resources must be protected. And what he's talking about here is this encyclical that was published by the Vatican in 2015, which is called Laudato Si, right? And so this is where Pope Francis actually said quite a radical thing at the time. He said, we need to be looking after the environment. We cannot be exploiting. We cannot be harming our natural resources. We need to be protecting them. They are part of us. They are part of our political ecology. So these are two texts. On the left, you've got Laudato Si. You can see the subtitle there on care for our common home. This idea of commoning, right? Infrastructural commoning, common resources. What you have on the right is actually, this is Father Sebastian. Father Sebastian is a pseudonym. This is the actual guy. He actually translated, he's the only person to translate Laudato Si into Sinhalese, right? And this is actually his translated version of Laudato Si, which he then distributed amongst the Catholic fraternity, the Catholic Brotherhood in Sri Lanka, right? So he's very much at the forefront of this political movement to try and get the Catholic Church and its peoples to try and take the natural world more seriously and to protect it rather than harm it. Okay, so the sea resources must be protected. My rights and resources must be protected. And he is part of what became known as a political movement, the headquartered in Negombo, but which sort of spreads throughout the western coastline, which is known as the PMAPC, which stands for the People's Movement Against Port City. Okay, People's Movement Against Port City. And that's important. So I'm going to come back to that in a little bit in the next slide. But before I do that, let me just tell you a little, or let me just share a little bit about what the effects of the port city has had on these fishing communities along Sri Lanka's western coastline. So this is from, the quote at the top here is from another Catholic priest called Father Delan, who says, this is him just narrating what has happened. This idea of the excavation of sand, sea sand, in large quantities. So when the excavation of sand takes place, the soil from near the coast slips down. You've got this slumping of the soil, and fish swim away from the shallow waters. So this is the process that I was explaining earlier, which I could see as I was talking to these fishermen on the beach. You see these huge ships off the coast, and they're literally just sucking up the sand from the seabed. And then, all the people that I spoke to would be telling me about where the coastline used to be, where the beach used to be. And now things are just eroding and moving further and further back inland because of this slumping of the sea. Now, that's just a sort of, sort of material territorial phenomenon. But what this means in terms of fishing is that these fishermen have to move further out, right? They have to fish further out. They have to fish for longer. They have to undertake much more dangerous voyages in those small boats that I showed you earlier, because maybe they have to fish overnight, or they need to fish for 18 hours a day instead of the usual 6 or so hours a day. So fishing becomes much more dangerous for them. It also becomes much harder because, fish stocks are depleting. They're being killed. The breeding grounds are being removed. The coral is being destroyed by the construction of the port city. So there's a lot less fish to go around, and the fish that are available are being moved further out to sea because of these effects of the port city construction. Rohan, the bottom quote there, Rohan, who's an NGO leader, he said they put up certain notices, this is the government, and also the Chinese responsible for the construction, they put up certain notices saying not to do any fishing activities. The mining operations are going on. So again, this is having this very real effect on the livelihoods of these communities, right? Their source of income, their source of wealth and of sort of meaning in life is being taken away from them by the port city. So with this, we're seeing the first splinter that I want to talk about, which is the splinter between the port city and the ocean, between the material and the natural world, this disharmony between these two infrastructural formations. Now, let me bring these ideas into much closer conversation with the Catholic Church. As I said, people like Father Sebastian, who translated Laudato Si into Sinhalese, he is the head of this movement called the People's Movement Against Port City. Now, this is another form of splinter because that faction, that small group of priests and fishermen and followers and things like that, they actually broke away from the main Catholic Church because for the reasons that I'll explain now. Okay. So this is from Rohan again, the NGO leader that we heard from in the last slide. So the cardinal of the Catholic Church in Sri Lanka, this is the head of the Catholic Church in Sri Lanka, a very prominent public figure, Malcolm Ranjith. He said, okay, we will work with the government. We will work until the government agrees that they take sand out from beyond 10 kilometers away from the shore. So he's using the influence, the political influence of the Catholic Church to lobby the government and get the government to make sure that the Chinese vessels that are dredging the sand, they only do so much further out. So they're not affecting the fishing activities of the local communities in Madara and Ngombe and places like that. That was his promise. He said, okay, we'll work with the government so that your livelihoods are less affected by this activity. That was the promise that was made to these communities. But after that, they kept quiet. Even though the Chinese continue to do their mining and dredging and other things close to the shore, the church said we have done our best, so we cannot do any more. So basically, they were ineffective. And where this gets political and where this gets interesting is that the bottom part of the quote there is that we realized that the Chinese company responsible for building the port city had bribed the Catholic Church by repairing one of the basilica, the churches here in Colombo. Apparently, they gave a donation of 30 million rupees, and then that caused people like Malcolm Ranjith and the Catholic hierarchy to stop lobbying the government. This is what I was told. There is one report in the Colombo Telegraph, which is one of the local newspapers in Sri Lanka, that this was the case as well. It was reported this 30 million rupee bribe and stuff. So there is some legitimacy to it, and many people mentioned this case. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is, again, in my view, in my sort of framing, my sort of interpretation, this is another example of infrastructural splintering, right? This is where we're seeing the Catholic Church splinting, becoming detached from the natural world, right? It's no longer from the ocean, from the aquatic ecosystems that has long depended on to make the communities that it speaks to prosperous and wealthy and thriving. We're also seeing a splinter between the Vatican, Laudato Si, this care for the natural world, and their hierarchy, the headquarters of the Catholic Church in Sri Lanka that Malcolm Ranjith represents. But then we're also seeing this much more local splinter within the hierarchy, within the Catholic Church itself, between those priests that align themselves with the People's Movement Against Port City, people like Father Sebastian, and then the Catholic priests that align themselves with the government or with the Chinese, and who are saying there's nothing wrong. We've done the best that we can. There's nothing more we can do. When actually there's a subset of much more radical priests that are really campaigning very hard to try and overcome the injustices that have been bestowed upon them. So this is what I mean by infrastructural splintering, where you've got all these different infrastructural formations coming into close contact with each other, the port city, the natural ecosystem of the ocean, and then the Catholic Church. They all come into very close contact and sort of into relation with each other. And that's what creates these splinters within these infrastructures to emerge. Last slide. I'm mindful of time. I've been going for 54 minutes, so I'm just wrapping up here. The last slide for this part. So let me just share a little bit more data with you. Again, this is just a few more quotes, just to, again, give this idea, to sort of flesh out this idea of infrastructural splintering in a bit more sort of detail. So at the top there, we have an environmental activist called Asanka, who's actually a Buddhist. He said that him and the PMAPC, the People's Movement Against Port City, and this group of resistant fishermen and Catholic priests, they would use the church, so the material infrastructure of the Catholic Church, the church buildings, as a gathering point. They would occupy the churches and use them to gather resistance against the mainstream church, or against the Chinese, or against the government. We use the church to organize the people, but without the priest. Without the priest, because the priest was always on the side of the port city. So again, this idea of splintering, of how the buildings, the actual infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of the Catholic Church becomes splintered between the people and the material symbolism of what a church building might be. And then some more, below that, just some more quotes. Hishan, who's a fisherman, the church is selling the problem to benefit, to get money. Again, this idea of corruption and lack of accountability. Percy, who's a journalist at the bottom there, the church is not supporting the people. The people are giving them, donations, tithes, whatever it may be, but they're not giving everything. They're just doing business. So this idea of, the neoliberalization and how religions adapt, right? Final thing. This is meant to be my conclusion, but if you read any of my papers, you will very quickly realize that I'm rubbish at concluding. I lose interest towards the conclusion. I put so much effort into the introduction, and then I just, by the time it gets to concluding stuff, I can't be bothered. I'm done. So this is very much the theme for today as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about what I've talked about, but maybe offer more of a looking forward perspective, which is, where does this work go from here? And there is, as I've sort of quite candidly told you, there is a big black hole in my understanding of Sri Lanka and what's happened, which is from early 2020 until now, which is there has been a debt crisis, there has been several quite dramatic changes in government, there's been a transformation of people's lifestyles and everyday ways of living, and that is the natural sort of jumping off point for, in my view, for future work on Sri Lanka. So I'm currently working on a book chapter, the title of which is The Debt to Whom. I'm thinking about this idea of the debt crisis. And I think this sort of gestures to larger ideas around the idea of religion, post-COVID recovery, and then the crisis of debt along the BRI. So I'll stop here. Thank you all very much for listening. I don't know if you have any questions. I hope I can answer them. As I said, I've sort of haven't worked explicitly on Sri Lanka for a while, so my knowledge is a little bit rusty, but I welcome any questions or any feedback you might have.